Hi everyone, this is a video presentation on advertising gender norms in the US from a sociological perspective. We will go over the impact of advertising in the US and its role in reinforcing traditional gender norms. We'll talk about the difference between the terms sex and gender, and we'll review conceptualizations of men and masculinity as well as conceptualizations of women and femininity, and we'll end with an analysis of print advertisements that reinforce traditional gender norms. First and foremost, we have to ask this question, so what? Why would a sociologist be interested in studying advertising in the US? Well, the fact of the matter is, advertising has a huge impact on how we function as a society, from our consumer habits to how our attitudes and beliefs are formed. So to give you some greater context, let's consider the following points. In 2019, $350 billion will be spent on advertising in the US. An effective advertisement is memorable, but most importantly, it communicates values. We're not talking about monetary value, we're talking about social values. Things like marriage, family, education, environment, diversity and inclusion, religion. Communicating social values may be a more powerful strategy than communicating a product's function when engaging with potential consumers. And finally, 500 to 1,000 is the number of commercial messages received by the average American per day. These messages reinforce these social values and social norms. As you can see, there's so many paths that sociologists can take in analyzing the impact of advertising, but today we're going to focus on advertisements and their role in impacting gender norms and reproducing gender norms. So before we move forward, we need to make the distinction between sex and gender, because oftentimes in daily life, sex and gender are used interchangeably, but we need to make time to differentiate the two. What does sex mean and what does gender mean? Sex is defined as either of the two major forms of individuals that occur in many species and that are distinguished respectively as female or male, especially on the basis of their reproductive organs and structures. Gender is defined as the behavioral, cultural, or psychological traits typically associated with one sex. In other words, the term sex refers to how society conceptualizes differences in males and females biologically. Gender, on the other hand, refers to how society conceptualizes differences in behaviors, expressions, attitudes, and traits between who we perceive to be men and who we perceive to be women, and perhaps any other representation of gender in between. So why the confusion between sex and gender? Well, throughout US history, there have been clearly defined gender roles for males and females. So gender norms have been very closely tied to who we see as men and who we see as women, and who we see as males and who we see as females. So these gender roles and gender norms are reinforced through things like culture, language, family, school, peers, religion, and mass media, which does include the $350 billion we'll be spending in the US in 2019. So now that we've differentiated gender from sex, let's continue to break down this idea of gender and talk about it specifically in the binary. Gender binary refers to the reduction of gender into only masculine and feminine. So masculine is typically associated with men, and feminine is typically associated with women. Gender binary is what we might refer back to when we discuss traditional ideas of what it means to be male versus female. And traditional notions of masculinity and femininity indicate that society perceives males and females as fundamentally different from each other. Men and women are traditionally accepted to follow specific gender norms. So let's take a look at some traditional attributes associated with men and women. This is the language we use when we talk about a masculine man. We use words like aggression, strength, career-minded, domination, and control. Boys are taught early on that it is acceptable and expected to roughhouse, act rambunctiously, and be forceful in order to get what you want. Men are expected to have more physical strength than women. Men are supposed to be driven by their careers, and it's acceptable for family to take a back seat. And finally, it's expected that men keep control of their homes, their families, and their women. These are terms that we typically associate with what it means to be a woman and what it means to be feminine. We've got words like passive, weak, nurturing, sexual, specifically sexual objectification. Women are expected to be soft-spoken and generally calmer than men. It's expected that women are not as strong as men and as such need to be protected. While men are supposed to be driven by their careers, women are expected to stay at home and care for their children. And women are expected to keep up their appearances according to society's standards of beauty, and they're consistently being objectified by men. So we covered a lot at this point. Let's pause to review. What did we just talk about? We had some time to unpack the impact of advertising. We also talked about conceptualizations of sex and gender, and specifically reviewed binary gender norms. So now that we've talked about masculinity versus femininity as gender norms, let's take a moment to look at some examples of print advertisements that reproduce these ideals. Here we have an ad from 2011 for a fragrance by Versace. The man in this image is the focus. He's holding on to the woman with dominance. He's also fully clothed while the woman is nude. So being nude equates to vulnerability. So in this scenario, the advertisement paints a very clear picture of who of the two has the power in the scenario. It's the man. Lastly, the man in the ad is wearing business-like attire, which shows he is likely in the public sphere, or at the very least, very successful in what he does career-wise. Now let's look at this ad from 2008 for Special K cereal. Like in the previous example, the woman is nude, which emphasizes again the role of the woman as a sexual object. It's interesting that this narrative of sexual objectification is used even for such a mundane product like breakfast cereal, right? And the expression on this woman's face makes it appear that she's passive and unthreatening. Her posture here makes her appear vulnerable, and overall the image portrays this woman as helpless, almost afraid, naked, alone, and seemingly in need of assistance. The narratives created in these images are definitely not unique to these products or brands. And let's recall why it's important to understand the messaging being communicated in these print ads. The average American is exposed to about 500 to 1,000 commercial messages a day, which reinforces these social values and norms. So in conclusion, these narratives you see here are communicating very specific values and reinforcing norms. Specifically, they're telling us as a society what it means to be a man and what it means to be a woman. So before we leave you, there are some things we want to acknowledge. This presentation covered traditional gender norms in binary terms, and this is just one perspective. Some cultures recognize a third gender. For example, Samoan culture has what is referred to as the fa'afafine, which is a third gender, often referring to men who take on feminine, stereotypically feminine attributes. And there is another conceptualization of gender as a spectrum, where we have stereotypically male attributes on one end, and on the other, stereotypically female. And then any one person, according to this framework, can fall in between on that spectrum. Right? So we just wanted to take a moment to unpack just one little sliver of this idea of gender, but we want to acknowledge that there is definitely more to learn. With that, here's a huge thank you for your time. Hope this presentation was informative, and we'd like to leave you with these questions. What advertisements in your recollection have attempted to break gender norms? And how has your own expression of gender been molded by advertisements in your lifetime? Again, thank you and have a great day.